He didn't leave her in a house, or on a cold sidewalk, or beside a half-packed suitcase. He left her on a private runway just after midnight, 8 months pregnant, watching the man who had once promised her forever prepare to fly to Paris with another woman. The air outside the small executive terminal in Teterboro was sharp enough to sting her cheeks, and the runway lights stretched ahead like a row of pale, judgmental stars. Grace Whitmore stood beneath them in a soft gray maternity coat that no longer buttoned, one hand resting beneath her belly, the other holding the phone Ethan Cole had finally answered after 3 days of silence. "Come to the airport," he had said, his voice flat, rushed, almost annoyed. "We need to settle this tonight." For one foolish, tired second, Grace had thought settle meant talk. She thought maybe he had seen the ultrasound picture she left on his desk. Maybe he had remembered the way their daughter had kicked when he used to play jazz in the kitchen. Maybe, somewhere inside the man who had become too polished to look at her directly, there was still a trace of the husband who once kissed flour from her cheek while they made pancakes in their first apartment. But when she stepped through the glass doors of the private terminal, she saw Ethan standing beside a sleek black suitcase, wearing a cashmere overcoat she had helped him choose, while Vanessa Hart leaned against his arm in cream-colored heels, smiling like she had already won something Grace had never agreed to lose. Ethan looked at Grace's belly first, then at her shoes, damp from the parking lot, then at the tired shadows beneath her eyes. He did not ask if she had eaten. He did not ask why she was breathing carefully, slowly, like every step had become a negotiation with pain. He reached into his coat and pulled out a white envelope. "This should be enough for you and the baby," he said, holding it between 2 fingers, as if even touching the edge of her life might stain him. The words landed softly, which made them worse. Vanessa glanced toward the jet waiting beyond the windows, its silver body glowing under the runway lights, then back at Grace with the kind of pity that had no kindness in it. Grace did not take the envelope right away. For a moment, all she could hear was the low hum of the aircraft, the distant voice of a ground crew member, the quiet click of Vanessa's bracelet as she adjusted her sleeve. Ethan sighed, impatient now. "Don't call me again," he said. "My attorney will handle everything." Grace looked at the envelope, then at the man she had loved through unpaid bills, late nights, failed pitches, and all the hungry years before his name meant anything to anyone. She remembered ironing his only good shirt before his first investor meeting. She remembered sitting in the hallway outside his office with coffee gone cold, praying someone would believe in him because she already did. And now he stood 10 feet away, offering money like mercy, leaving like responsibility was a weather delay he could fly above. The baby moved beneath her palm, small and alive and trusting. That was what kept Grace standing. Not pride, not anger, something quieter, something stronger. She took the envelope at last, folded it once without looking inside, and placed it carefully on the reception counter beside a crystal bowl of mints. Ethan's jaw tightened. "Grace," he said, warning in his voice, as though dignity had become an inconvenience. She lifted her eyes to him. They were not dramatic eyes. They were not begging eyes. They were the eyes of a woman realizing that the person in front of her had just become part of her past, while she was still standing in the present. "Have a safe flight," she said. Vanessa laughed under her breath, but Grace did not look at her. She turned toward the exit with one slow hand on her belly and walked back through the automatic doors into the cold New Jersey night. Behind her, the jet engines deepened, swallowing the silence Ethan had left behind. A few minutes later, the aircraft rolled forward, then lifted into the dark, carrying him away from the woman he thought he had abandoned and the child he thought money could erase. Grace stood beside the curb, her breath turning white in the air, and watched the taillights of the jet vanish above the city. She did not cry. Not there. Not for him. She only reached into her coat pocket, found the folded ultrasound photo, and pressed it gently against her heart. "It's just us now," she whispered to her unborn daughter. Then she stepped toward the taxi stand, alone beneath the runway lights, not knowing that one day, another private jet would land for her, and this time, the man who left would be the one forced to watch. Before Ethan Cole learned how to wear expensive suits and speak in polished rooms, he had been a man with a failing company, a used laptop, and a wife who believed in him with the kind of faith that made no noise. Grace Whitmore had met him when his office was a rented corner above a dry cleaner in Hoboken, where the heat rattled in winter and the air conditioner gave out every July. Back then, Ethan stayed up until 2 in the morning building pitch decks no one wanted to read, and Grace sat beside him on the floor with takeout coffee, correcting spelling errors, rearranging slides, and pretending not to notice when his hands shook before investor calls. She was not rich. She was not connected in the way people in Manhattan respected, but she knew spaces. She understood how a room could make someone feel safe, important, seen. When Ethan needed his first client to trust a hotel renovation concept he could barely afford to present, it was Grace who sketched the lobby by hand at their kitchen table, shading the marble columns with a broken pencil while a pot of cheap pasta boiled behind her. Ethan had kissed the top of her head that night and whispered, "When this works, everyone will know what you did for me." But success has a strange way of changing the volume of promises. The first check came, then the second, then a photo of Ethan in a business magazine standing under warm lights with people who pronounced his name like it belonged there. Grace was proud at first. She framed the article and placed it near the coffee maker. She bought him a navy tie for his first gala and stayed home hemming her own black dress because there was not enough money for alterations. At the event, she stood beside him quietly while men in cufflinks asked Ethan about growth, strategy, and vision. No one asked Grace about the sketches behind the project. No one knew she had stayed awake for weeks making those rooms breathe. Ethan knew, but that night, when someone mistook her for an assistant, he only smiled tightly and said nothing. The silence was small, almost easy to excuse. Then came other silences. He stopped introducing her as the person who helped build the company. He began saying "my team" instead of Grace. He moved meetings to private clubs where she was not invited, took calls in the hallway, changed the password on his phone, and started coming home smelling faintly of expensive cologne that was not his. Grace told herself he was under pressure. She told herself powerful rooms made people careful. She told herself marriage was not measured by every cold dinner left on the stove. Then one afternoon, standing in their bathroom with sunlight across the tile, she looked down at a pregnancy test and felt her whole world become tender and terrifying at once. She waited until Ethan came home. She placed the test in a small white gift box, tied it with a blue ribbon because it was the only ribbon she had, and watched his face as he opened it. For half a second, she searched for joy. She searched for surprise, fear, anything human. But Ethan only sat back, stared at the tiny plastic window, and rubbed his thumb over his wedding ring like it had become too tight. "This is not the right time," he said. Grace laughed once because she thought he must be joking. He was not. That was the first time she felt the floor of her marriage shift beneath her feet. After that, his absences became cleaner, more organized, as if leaving her had become a project he intended to manage well. He sent flowers without notes. He paid bills without coming home. He spoke to her kindly when other people were around and coldly when they were alone. When Vanessa Hart appeared at a charity dinner 3 months later, all gold hair and practiced softness, Grace understood the shape of the truth before anyone said it out loud. Vanessa touched Ethan's sleeve in a way no stranger should, and Ethan did not move away. Grace stood across the room with one hand on her growing belly, wearing the same black dress she had altered twice, watching her husband laugh at something another woman whispered near his ear. The betrayal did not arrive like thunder. It arrived like a door closing gently in another room. And by the time he summoned her to that private airport months later, Ethan had already rewritten their story in his mind. In his version, Grace was the burden, the reminder of years he wanted to outgrow, the woman who knew him before he became impressive. He forgot the unpaid invoices she sorted, the anxious nights she held his hand, the designs she gave away under his name. He forgot because remembering would have required shame. Grace remembered everything. That was why, when the jet lifted into the night and left her beneath the runway lights, the pain did not feel sudden. It felt like the final page of a book she had been trying not to finish. By the time Grace reached the small apartment in Jersey City, the sky above the Hudson had begun to pale. Not quite morning, not quite night, the kind of hour when the world looked unfinished. She paid the taxi driver with a card that almost declined, thanked him softly, and climbed the 3 flights of stairs one step at a time because the elevator had been broken for 2 weeks and the landlord kept promising someone would come by. Inside, the apartment was quiet in the way empty places become quiet after someone leaves them on purpose. Ethan's side of the closet was bare. His coffee mug was gone from the sink. The framed magazine article she had once placed near the kitchen window had been taken down, leaving behind a clean rectangle on the wall where the sun had not faded the paint. Grace stood there for a long moment with her coat still on, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the faint traffic below. Then she removed her shoes, folded her coat over the chair, and walked into the bedroom without turning on the light. She did not sleep. Her body was too tired for rest, her mind too full of small, ordinary betrayals. At 6 in the morning, she opened the banking app on her phone and saw numbers that felt colder than the airport runway. Ethan had paid the rent for that month and nothing more. There were medical bills waiting, groceries to buy, a crib still in a box against the wall, and a daughter arriving soon into a life Grace had not finished building. She placed both hands on her belly and breathed through the tightness in her chest. "We will figure it out," she whispered, not because she knew how, but because the baby deserved to hear certainty somewhere. The first signs came 2 nights later, soft at first, like a warning written in a language she had only recently learned. Grace was standing in the kitchen, stirring oatmeal because it was cheap and warm, when she felt the first deep pull across her lower back. She froze, spoon in hand, and looked toward the phone on the counter. Ethan's number was still saved under husband. She stared at the word until it seemed almost embarrassing, like a label from a life that no longer fit. Then another wave came, stronger, steady enough to make her grip the edge of the counter. She called him once. The phone rang until it went to voicemail. She called again from the bedroom while packing the hospital bag with shaking hands. No answer. She called from the hallway, from the stairwell, from the back seat of a rideshare, 17 times before the hospital lights came into view. Each time, the same cheerful recorded voice asked her to leave a message. She left none. There are moments when silence gives an answer clearly enough. At the hospital, a nurse with silver hair helped her into a wheelchair and asked who should be contacted. Grace opened her mouth, then closed it. The nurse understood more than she said. She only squeezed Grace's shoulder and wrote down emergency contact pending. The room smelled like antiseptic and clean sheets, and outside the window, dawn pressed a thin gold line over the buildings. Grace labored through the morning with no flowers on the table, no anxious father pacing the hall, no familiar hand holding hers. But she was not as alone as Ethan had imagined. The nurse came back again and again with warm blankets. A young doctor spoke to her gently, explaining every step. An older woman in the next room laughed when her grandchild was born, and somehow that sound did not make Grace bitter. It reminded her that joy still existed in the building, even if it had skipped her door for a while. When her daughter finally arrived, small and furious and alive, the world narrowed to one cry. Grace forgot the unanswered calls. She forgot the runway, the envelope, the silver jet disappearing into the dark. The nurse placed the baby against her chest, and Grace looked down at the tiny face, the pale lashes, the soft mouth trembling with its first argument against the world. "Lily," she whispered, because she had chosen the name months ago and never asked Ethan if he liked it. Lily Whitmore. Not because Grace wanted to erase anything, but because some names had to be earned, and Ethan had not earned hers. Later, when a hospital clerk brought the birth certificate form, Grace paused at the line marked father. The pen hovered above the paper. For 1 second, she imagined writing Ethan Cole, imagined giving him a place in the first official document of Lily's life after he had refused to answer the first 17 calls of it. Then Lily stirred in the clear bassinet beside her, one tiny fist opening as if reaching for light. Grace drew a slow breath and left the line blank. Not out of anger, out of truth. By evening, snow began to fall beyond the window, soft and soundless over the hospital parking lot. Grace held Lily close, counting each breath against her collarbone. She was exhausted, frightened, and poorer than she had ever been. But when her daughter curled against her, warm and real, something inside Grace settled. Ethan had left her with bills, silence, and a last name full of memories. He had not left her empty. In that quiet hospital room, with no witness but the falling snow, Grace stopped waiting for anyone to return. She kissed Lily's forehead and understood that from that moment on, survival was not a choice. It was a promise. For the first few weeks after Lily was born, Grace learned that survival did not look heroic. It looked like counting quarters on the kitchen counter while a bottle warmed in a mug of hot water. It looked like washing the same two work shirts at midnight because the laundromat was cheaper after 9. It looked like answering emails with one hand while Lily slept against her shoulder, tiny breaths warming the collar of a sweater Grace had owned since college. The apartment in Jersey City became smaller after the baby came home, not because the walls moved, but because every corner had to become useful. The dining table became a desk. The desk became a changing station. The windowsill held unpaid bills, grocery coupons, and fabric samples Grace could not bring herself to throw away. Some mornings, she woke before sunrise to the sound of delivery trucks below and wondered how many women in the city were doing the same thing, standing barefoot in dark kitchens, trying to become brave before the coffee finished brewing. She found work where she could. 3 days a week, she took the early shift at a neighborhood coffee shop near Grove Street, tying a black apron around her waist while Mrs. Alvarez from the second floor watched Lily in exchange for reduced rent on a room Grace had quietly redesigned for her the month before. On the other days, Grace cleaned up old design files, drafted small apartment layouts for clients who found her through online listings, and accepted jobs that paid too little because too little was still more than nothing. She learned to measure rooms with Lily strapped to her chest, whispering numbers under her breath while the baby reached for cabinet handles and sunlight. 10 feet, for inches. 7 feet, 9 inches. 32 inches between the window and the radiator. There was dignity in precision. There was dignity in showing up with a pencil behind her ear, a clean folder in her hand, and no explanation for the tiredness beneath her eyes. People often tried to guess her story. Some were kind in the way that made her feel exposed. A woman at the grocery store once looked at Lily, then at Grace's bare ring finger, and said, "You are so strong," as if strength were a prize Grace had applied for. Grace smiled, thanked her, and pushed the stroller toward the checkout with a carton of milk, 2 apples, and store-brand oatmeal. She did not want to be admired for surviving. She wanted to buy diapers without doing math in her head. She wanted to sleep 4 hours in a row. She wanted her daughter to grow up in rooms where love did not feel temporary. Ethan's name appeared sometimes, never in person. It appeared on legal letters with polished language and careful distance. It appeared in business articles about his rapid rise and his bold vision for luxury hospitality. It appeared once on a charity event photograph, his hand resting near Vanessa's back beneath chandeliers that looked like frozen rain. Grace saw the image while standing in line at a pharmacy, Lily asleep in the stroller, and felt something quiet close inside her. Not rage, not jealousy, something cleaner. A door. She stopped searching for reasons. She stopped imagining apologies. She stopped rehearsing conversations where Ethan finally understood what he had done. Understanding was no longer her job to provide. Winter turned into spring. Lily grew rounder, louder, brighter. Her laugh filled the apartment in sudden bursts, like lights slipping under a door. Grace began taking evening classes online after Lily fell asleep, refreshing software skills she had abandoned while building Ethan's dream. She practiced renderings until 2 in the morning, the glow of her laptop painting her face blue while the city hummed beyond the glass. When exhaustion blurred the screen, she would stand, stretch her back, and look at Lily sleeping in the second-hand crib she had assembled alone. That was enough to sit down again. Month by month, her designs changed. They became less like the elegant rooms Ethan had once sold under his name and more like Grace herself. Warm without begging, quiet without disappearing, refined without cruelty. She learned that empty rooms did not need extravagance to feel valuable. They needed intention. A chair placed where morning light could find it. A hallway softened by color. A cheap apartment made graceful by clean lines and hope. By Lily's first birthday, Grace had moved from the coffee shop counter to a tiny shared studio in Newark, where she rented one desk beside a window overlooking train tracks. She brought Lily there on Saturdays, spreading a blanket under the desk while she worked. The trains passed every 15 minutes, shaking the glass, and Lily would clap as if each one had arrived just for her. Grace would laugh then, really laugh, with pencil dust on her fingers and sunlight on her face. She still owed money. She still woke frightened some nights. She still carried the memory of the runway in a place no one could see. But she no longer felt abandoned. Abandonment was what Ethan had done. It was not who she was. And in that small studio, With her daughter playing at her feet and a new floor plan opening across the screen, Grace began to build a life no one else had permission to define. The first time Alexander Hayes saw Grace Whitmore's work, he did not see her face. He saw a floor plan spread across the counter of a 24-hour print shop in Newark, held down at the corners by a coffee cup, a pacifier, a roll of masking tape, and a set of keys with a faded yellow duck attached. It was close to 11 at night, the kind of hour when the city lights looked tired and the glass doors reflected more loneliness than traffic. Alexander had come in because the printer at his hotel had failed before a morning presentation, and his driver had found the only place nearby still open. He wore a dark wool coat and carried himself with the quiet ease of a man who never had to announce importance because rooms adjusted around him anyway. But when he passed the counter, he stopped. The drawing was not large. It was not printed on expensive paper. Some of the notes were written in pencil along the margins, neat but rushed, as if someone had made them between feeding a child and answering an email. Still, the design had something most luxury renderings did not. Warmth. Not the kind people bought to impress guests, but the kind that made a stranger imagine setting down their bags and breathing easier. A narrow lobby had been opened with curved seating near the windows. A cold hallway had been softened by light wood, cream paint, and a line of small brass fixtures that would make evening feel gentle instead of lonely. Whoever designed it understood that elegance was not noise. It was mercy arranged carefully. Behind the counter, Grace was balancing Lily on one hip while explaining to the clerk that she only needed 3 copies, not 6, because 3 copies were what she could afford. Lily, now almost 2, had a pink mitten in her mouth and one sock slipping off her heel. Grace reached down to fix it, then caught the edge of the paper before it curled from the machine. There was nothing glamorous about the moment. Her hair was tied back with a black elastic. Her coat was missing a button. A tiny smear of applesauce marked one sleeve. Yet Alexander noticed the way she handled the drawings, not like paper, but like something alive that had survived being carried through weather. "Excuse me," he said. Grace turned with the guarded politeness of a woman used to being interrupted when she was already late. "Yes." Alexander nodded toward the plans. "Did you design that yourself?" Grace's hand moved slightly over the page, protective before she could stop herself. "I did. For a client. For a small apartment building in Queens. The owner wants the lobby to feel less temporary." The corner of Alexander's mouth softened, not quite a smile, but close. "That is an unusual way to describe a lobby." Grace looked down at the drawing. Lily leaned against her shoulder, sleepy now, her pale lashes resting against her cheeks. "People can feel when a place expects them to leave," Grace said. "I try to design spaces that ask them to stay." Alexander was silent for a moment. He had sat through hundreds of presentations filled with words like premium, exclusive, elevated, and world-class. None of them had stayed with him as cleanly as that sentence. He reached into his coat and pulled out a simple business card. Thick white stock, black lettering, no gold, no performance. "My name is Alexander Hayes," he said. Grace glanced at the card, then back at him. She knew the name. Anyone who had ever worked near hospitality knew the name. Hayes Global owned hotels in New York, Miami, Los Angeles, Aspen, and half the places Ethan had once dreamed of entering. Grace did not gasp. She did not flatter him. She only adjusted Lily higher on her hip and said, "I am Grace Whitmore. I am reviewing concepts for a boutique hotel restoration in Soho," Alexander said. "Your work understands. Something I have been asking firms to find for 6 months." Grace almost laughed, but the sound did not come. Men in expensive coats did not usually appear at print shops near midnight offering opportunities to women with tired eyes and children half asleep on their shoulders. Life had taught her to be careful with doors that opened too suddenly. "I appreciate that," she said, "but I do not have a large firm." Alexander's eyes moved once to Lily, then back to Grace, without pity, without calculation. "I did not ask if you had a large firm. I asked if you designed that." For some reason, that answer reached a place in her that praise never had. He was not looking at the missing button, or the stroller folded near her feet, or the exhaustion she could no longer hide. He was looking at the work, the part of her Ethan had borrowed, buried, and forgotten to credit. Lily stirred, mumbling softly, and Grace lowered her voice. "I have responsibilities," she said. "I cannot chase something unstable." Alexander placed the card beside the drawings, not pushing it toward her, not turning kindness into pressure. Then do not chase it. Read the proposal. Decide in the morning. If the answer is no, I will respect it. He paused at the door before leaving, the cold night sliding in around him. But Grace, rooms like that are not designed by someone ordinary. Then he was gone, and the print shop became ordinary again. Humming lights, warm paper, Lily's sleepy breathing against her neck. Grace stood still for a long moment, staring at the card beside her 3 copies. Outside, a train passed in the distance, shaking the window just enough to make the paper tremble. For the first time in years, opportunity had not arrived dressed as rescue. It had arrived as recognition. Grace did not call Alexander Hayes the next morning. She placed his card in the top drawer of her desk at the shared studio, between a utility bill and Lily's vaccination record, then told herself that some opportunities belonged to women with savings accounts, backup plans, and grandparents who could babysit on short notice. For 2 days, she worked around the card as if it were a lit match. She answered client emails, measured a narrow brownstone kitchen in Brooklyn, picked Lily up from Mrs. Alvarez, and made macaroni and cheese with peas because Lily liked to separate the peas one by one and line them along the edge of her plate. But every time Grace opened the drawer, the name was there, quiet and patient. Hayes Global. On the 3rd night, after Lily fell asleep with one hand wrapped around a stuffed rabbit, Grace sat at the kitchen table and opened the proposal Alexander had sent. It was not vague. It was not glamorous language hiding an unfair deal. It was a serious invitation to consult on the restoration of a historic boutique hotel in Soho, with fair pay, flexible hours, and her name listed plainly on the creative documents. Her name, not Ethan's company, not a team she would disappear inside. Grace Whitmore. She read that line 3 times before closing the laptop. The next morning, she called Alexander from the sidewalk outside the coffee shop where she had once worked, the same street smelling of roasted beans, wet pavement, and early traffic. Her voice stayed calm even though her fingers were cold around the phone. I can take the meeting, she said, but I need to be clear. My daughter comes first. I cannot pretend I am available at all hours to make powerful people comfortable. There was a pause on the other end, not offended, not surprised. Good, Alexander said. People who know their priorities usually make better decisions. That was how it began. Not with rescue, not with romance. With a conference room, a contract, and a woman walking in with a portfolio under one arm and a diaper bag under the other. At the first meeting, the senior architect spoke quickly, moving through budgets, structural limits, brand language, and guest experience. Grace listened more than she spoke. She noticed what they skipped. The lobby was beautiful, but cold. The guest rooms were expensive, but forgettable. The restaurant had perfect lighting for photographs and no corner where a tired traveler might want to sit alone with soup. When someone finally asked her opinion, several faces turned politely, expecting a small suggestion. Grace looked at the renderings on the screen and said, "It looks like a hotel trying to impress people who do not sleep there." The room went still. A junior associate lowered his pen. Alexander leaned back in his chair, eyes steady on her, not rescuing her from the silence. Grace did not apologize. She walked to the screen and pointed to the entrance flow, the dead space near the windows, the wasted alcove by the elevator banks. She spoke about morning light, luggage paths, lobby acoustics, the way guests entered with public faces and private exhaustion. She did not use big words to sound important. She used precise ones because precision had been keeping her alive for almost 2 years. By the end of the hour, no one was looking at her coat or the plain heels she had polished in the kitchen before sunrise. They were looking at the work. The Soho project changed everything slowly, then all at once. Grace redesigned the lobby around warmth instead of spectacle. She turned narrow corridors into soft transitions. She chose fabrics that looked elegant but could survive real families, real suitcases, real life. Alexander never hovered. He did not praise her in a way that made her feel owned. He asked questions, listened to the answers, and made sure the invoices were paid on time. When Lily had a fever, he moved a presentation without making Grace explain twice. When a vendor tried to speak over her, Alexander looked at the vendor and said, "Ms. Whitmore has the final word on this room." It was the first time in years that power stood beside her without asking for anything in return. The hotel opened 9 months later under a wash of soft gold light and quiet music. Critics called it intimate, graceful, unexpectedly human. Guests posted photos of the lobby chairs, the reading alcove, the brass lamps reflected in old mirrors. No one knew the whole story behind the woman who designed it, and Grace preferred it that way. She stood near the back during the opening, Lily asleep against Mrs. Alvarez's shoulder, and watched strangers feel comfortable inside a space she had built from the parts of herself Ethan once dismissed. More offers followed. A townhouse in Boston, a coastal inn in Maine, a private club, renovation in Charleston. Grace did not chase fame, but her work traveled without asking permission. To protect her privacy, she signed under a small studio name, GW Studio. The initials began appearing in design blogs, then trade magazines, then quiet conversations among people who had once ignored her. By the time Lily turned 3, Grace had moved out of the shared studio into a sunlit office with 6 desks, white oak shelves, and a corner filled with Lily's crayons. On the glass door, the letters were small, almost modest. GW Studio. Ethan Cole saw those letters for the first time in a luxury hospitality report while sitting in his Manhattan office, unaware that the mysterious designer everyone wanted to hire was the same woman he had left beneath airport lights. He circled the name with a silver pen and told his assistant to find a way in. Across the river, Grace was kneeling beside Lily, helping her choose between 2 shades of cream for a sample board. Lily picked the warmer one. Grace smiled. "Good eye," she whispered. Outside, afternoon light filled the office, and for once, nothing in the room felt borrowed. 3 years after the night Grace stood beneath the runway lights, Ethan Cole sat in the back of a black car crossing the bridge into Palm Beach and read the same sentence for the 4th time. Hayes Global will select its final design and development partner during the private signing event on Friday afternoon. He lowered the tablet slightly and looked out at the rows of palm trees flashing past the tinted window, their shadows sliding over the leather seats like bars of dark water. The sun was too bright, the sky too perfect, and every building beyond the glass seemed polished by money he suddenly needed more than he wanted to admit. Ethan's company had grown fast, then stretched too thin. A failed resort deal in Arizona, a delayed renovation in Chicago, and 2 nervous investors had turned his confidence into something brittle. The contract with Hayes Global was not just another opportunity. It was oxygen. Without it, the board would start asking questions Ethan could not answer with charm. Vanessa sat beside him in a white linen dress, scrolling through photos from the hotel where they had spent the night. She looked unchanged in the ways money could preserve: glossy hair, diamond bracelet, careful smile. But there was a restlessness around her eyes whenever Ethan's phone rang, and he did not immediately relax. "You are staring at that report like it is going to bite you," she said. Ethan locked the screen. "It is a major contract. It is a hotel contract. It is Hayes Global." Vanessa tilted her head, then smiled as if his concern amused her. "Then do what you always do. Walk in, make them feel important, and leave with what you came for." Ethan did not answer. Usually, he liked hearing things like that. Usually, they reminded him of the man he had worked so hard to become. But lately, rooms had stopped bending as easily. People asked for numbers now, proof now, results now. His name still opened doors, but not all the way. The event was being held at a private aviation lounge attached to a luxury resort development site, the kind of place designed to make wealth feel effortless. Glass walls overlooked the runway. White orchids sat in stone planters. A silver coffee service gleamed beneath soft lights. Outside, small jets waited with their noses pointed toward the Atlantic, patient as expensive animals. Ethan stepped from the car and adjusted his cuff links, the same gesture he used before difficult meetings, then offered Vanessa his arm. The moment they entered, he began scanning faces. Investors, developers, attorneys, hotel executives, all drifting between low conversations and chilled sparkling water. On a display near the reception desk, the names of the shortlisted firms appeared in a clean black font. Ethan found his company, Cole Meridian Group, then moved his eyes lower and saw the name that had been haunting every industry report for months. GW Studio. No photograph. No founder biography. No public interviews. Just initials attached to spaces everyone praised as intimate, refined, unforgettable. Ethan had instructed his assistant to learn everything about them and received almost nothing useful. Boutique. Private, selective, closely tied to Hayes Global. Impossible to reach. Without an introduction. The mystery irritated him. It also made him want the partnership more. There it is, Vanessa said, following his gaze. The little studio everyone keeps whispering about. Ethan smiled without warmth. Every industry has a flavor of the year. Near the window, a little girl in a pale yellow dress darted past a cluster of adults, laughing as a ribbon slipped from her hair. She could not have been more than 3. A woman from event staff bent to retrieve it, but the child reached it first, proud of herself, then turned in a small circle as if searching for someone. Vanessa glanced down as the girl came too close to her shoes. Careful, she said, not loudly, but sharp enough to make the child pause. Ethan barely looked at the girl. Something about the pale hair and bright eyes brushed against a memory he did not want to open, but he dismissed it before it formed. Children looked alike at that age. Besides, Grace would never be here. In his mind, Grace still belonged to the life behind him. Small apartment, tired coat, quiet disappointment. He had not seen her in years. His attorney had handled what needed handling. Payments had been minimal, formal, clean. He had told himself that if she wanted more, she would have asked. He had told himself many things because successful men often survived by making their own version of mercy. A resort executive approached then, saving him from the thought. Handshakes followed. Polite laughter. Mentions of market expansion and brand alignment. Ethan's voice settled into its practiced rhythm, smooth enough to hide the pressure tightening behind his ribs. Across the lounge, the little girl ran toward an older woman holding a juice box, then stopped near the glass with her palms against it, watching the runway. "Mommy is coming soon," the older woman said gently. Ethan heard the words without listening. He was too busy watching the entrance, waiting for Alexander Hayes, waiting for whoever represented GW Studio, waiting for the decision that could save him. Vanessa leaned close and whispered, "I still think this mystery designer is probably some overpaid man with a dramatic publicist." Ethan smirked. "If he is smart, he will want distribution. That is where I come in." But outside, beyond the glass, a low-engine note began to rise. Conversations thinned. Heads turned toward the runway as a private jet descended through the bright Florida sky, its white body catching the sun, the Hayes Global emblem visible near the tail. The little girl at the window pressed closer, her face lighting with recognition. Ethan lifted his chin, preparing the expression he used for powerful men. He had no idea that the person stepping off that jet would not be a stranger to impress, but the past he had abandoned, arriving in a form he could no longer afford to ignore. The jet touched down so smoothly that the runway seemed to receive it rather than resist it. For a few seconds, no one in the lounge spoke. The white aircraft rolled past the glass with the Hayes Global emblem shining near the tail, and the sound of its engines settled into the room like a warning disguised as elegance. Ethan straightened his shoulders, already arranging his face into confidence. He expected Alexander Hayes first, a handshake, a measured smile, perhaps the usual exchange of polished men pretending not to need each other. The stairs unfolded. A ground crew member stepped forward. Then Alexander appeared at the doorway in a navy suit, calm against the bright Florida sky. He did not hurry. He looked toward the lounge windows, lifted one hand in brief acknowledgement, and descended the steps with the quiet authority of a man who never had to chase attention. Ethan took one step forward. Vanessa adjusted her bracelet. Several executives near the reception desk began moving toward the private entrance. But Alexander did not enter. He turned back toward the aircraft and offered his hand to someone still inside. That small gesture changed the air before Ethan understood why. A woman stepped into the sunlight, and for one long, impossible second, Ethan's mind refused to give her a name. She wore an ivory suit, tailored so cleanly it looked almost weightless, with her pale hair swept low at the nape of her neck. No heavy diamonds. No performance. Only a thin gold ring, pearl earrings, and the kind of stillness that made every bright thing around her seem less certain of itself. Then she lifted her face. Grace Whitmore. The name moved through Ethan silently, like a glass cracking from the inside. She was not the woman from the runway, not the exhausted figure in the gray maternity coat, not the memory he had stored away under inconvenience. She looked composed, rested, untouchable in a way that had nothing to do with money and everything to do with no longer asking the world for permission. Alexander kept his hand beneath hers until she reached the tarmac, then released it with respect, not display. Behind them, an assistant stepped down carrying a small cream-colored backpack with a yellow ribbon tied to the handle. The little girl at the window suddenly burst away from Mrs. Alvarez, her face bright with recognition. "Mommy," she called, her voice clear enough to cut through the lounge. Grace turned at once. All the cool distance in her expression softened, not for the room, not for the executives, but for the child running toward the private entrance. A staff member opened the glass door, and Lily ran outside in her pale yellow dress, one ribbon loose in her hair. Grace bent just enough to catch her, laughing quietly as Lily wrapped both arms around her waist. "You made it before the meeting," Grace said. "I waited by the window," Lily answered proudly. Alexander crouched beside them and lifted the fallen ribbon from Lily's shoulder. "And you did an excellent job guarding the runway," he said. Lily giggled and leaned against him with the natural trust of a child who knew exactly where she was safe. Ethan watched the scene with his hand frozen near his jacket button. Pale hair, bright eyes, 3 years old. The pieces did not fall into place, they struck. Vanessa's smile disappeared so slowly it looked painful to maintain. "Ethan," she whispered, but he did not look at her. Grace rose with Lily's hand tucked in hers and walked toward the lounge entrance beside Alexander Hayes. The glass doors opened, letting in a wash of heat, sunlight, and the faint scent of jet fuel. Conversations collapsed into murmurs. A senior executive from Hayes Global stepped forward with a folder pressed to his chest. "Mrs. Hayes, Mr. Hayes, welcome back to Palm Beach," he said warmly. Ethan felt the title land harder than any accusation could have. Mrs. Hayes, not Miss Whitmore. Not his abandoned wife. Not the woman he had paid to disappear. Grace's eyes passed over the room, professional and calm, until they reached him. She did not flinch. She did not smile cruelly. She only paused for the smallest fraction of time, as if acknowledging an old photograph in a house she no longer owned. Ethan tried to speak. Her name formed in his throat, but came out thin. "Grace." Lily looked up at him with innocent curiosity, then back at her mother. Grace placed a gentle hand on Lily's shoulder. Alexander's expression did not change, but he moved half a step closer, not blocking her, simply standing with her. That was the difference Ethan noticed too late. Alexander did not possess the room by making Grace smaller. He made room for her to stand fully inside it. One of Ethan's investors approached, unaware of the history tightening the air. "Mr. Cole, you know Mrs. Hayes?" Ethan opened his mouth, but no answer came cleanly. Grace gave the investor a courteous nod. "We met a long time ago," she said. "Not we were married. Not he left me. Not this is the man who did not answer the phone. Just that." A sentence so quiet it removed him from the center of his own memory. Vanessa looked from Grace to Lily to Alexander, calculating what everyone else was beginning to understand. The mysterious GW studio. The designer no one could reach. The woman arriving by private jet with the chairman of Hayes Global. Grace took the folder from the executive and glanced at the printed schedule. "Shall we begin?" she asked. Her voice was steady, low, and entirely professional. The room moved because she had spoken. Ethan remained still, watching as Grace walked past him toward the conference doors, Lily holding Mrs. Alvarez's hand behind her, Alexander at her side. The last time he had seen Grace near an aircraft, he had believed the sky belonged to him. Now the jet waited outside for her, gleaming in the Florida sun, while Ethan stood inside the glass, realizing that karma had not come shouting. It had landed quietly, stepped down in ivory, and carried his daughter's eyes. Inside the conference room, the glass walls made everything visible. The runway, the waiting jet, the executives taking their seats with careful faces. Ethan sat across from Grace at the long white table, close enough to see that her hands did not tremble when she opened the folder. That disturbed him more than anger would have. Anger would have given him a doorway back into the story, a place to stand as the man who mattered enough to wound her. But Grace was calm in a way that made him feel strangely absent, as if the worst thing he had ever done had become only one page in a much larger book she had written without him. Alexander sat beside her, not at the head of the table, though everyone knew he could have. He let Grace begin. She spoke about the Palm Beach property with the same quiet precision she had once used in their old kitchen, when Ethan had barely listened because he thought ambition belonged to him alone. She described guest flow, coastal light, long-term value, acoustic privacy, family suites that felt elegant without feeling fragile. Every sentence carried weight. Every recommendation had numbers behind it. The investors leaned in. The Hayes Global team took notes. Ethan tried to focus on strategy, but his eyes kept moving to the initials on the proposal cover. GW Studio. Grace Whitmore. The woman he had written out of his rise had become the signature he needed to survive. When presentations ended, the room settled into a silence too polished to be comfortable. Alexander folded his hands. Mrs. Hayes has reviewed all development partners, he said. The final recommendation is hers. Vanessa, seated along the wall, looked down at her lap. Ethan felt heat rise beneath his collar. Grace, he said, softer now, careful enough to sound almost humble. May I speak with you privately? Grace closed the folder without rushing. Anything relevant to the proposal can be said here. The sentence was professional. That made it sharper. Ethan swallowed. There are things you do not understand about what happened back then. For the first time, Grace looked directly at him for more than a second. The room seemed to recede around her. I understood enough, she said. I understood the empty apartment. I understood the unanswered calls. I understood the envelope on the runway. No one moved. Even the air conditioning seemed quieter. Ethan glanced toward the executives, then back at her, panic beginning to show through the polish. I was under pressure. I made mistakes. I did not know how hard it was for you. Grace's expression did not change. You knew I was 8 months pregnant. You knew I had no ride home. You knew your child was coming. She paused, not to wound him, but to let truth arrive without ornament. You knew enough to leave. The words did not rise. They did not need to. Vanessa's face had gone pale, and one of Ethan's investors stared at the table as if he wished the glass beneath them would become a door. Ethan reached for the only thing left. I can make it right. Grace looked toward the window, where Lily stood outside the conference room with Mrs. Alvarez, pressing a sticker onto the back of her hand. The sight softened her, but only for her daughter. My daughter does not need a man to remember her when his life becomes inconvenient, she said. She has a home. She has stability. She has people who show up. Alexander said nothing. He did not rescue the moment, because Grace did not need rescuing. She turned the final page of the folder and placed a signed recommendation on the table. GW Studio will not proceed with Cole Meridian Group. Your financial exposure is too high. Your recent projects show repeated delays, and your leadership record does not meet the ethical standard Hayes Global requires. The decision was clean, factual, impossible to challenge without exposing more. Ethan stared at the paper as if it had taken the shape of a door closing. Grace gathered her documents, stood, and gave the room a courteous nod. Thank you for your time. That was all. No speech. No tears. No revenge dressed as theater. She walked out before regret could ask for applause. In the lounge, Lily ran to her, and Grace bent to receive her with both arms. Alexander followed a step behind, carrying the small cream backpack with the yellow ribbon. Outside, the private jet waited in the afternoon sun, bright against the blue Florida sky. Ethan came to the conference room doorway, just in time to see Grace pause near the glass. For a moment, their eyes met across the distance. He looked older than he had that night at the airport, not because of years, but because consequences had finally found his reflection. Grace gave him nothing to hold. No hatred, no invitation, no unfinished question. Then Lily slipped her hand into Grace's. Alexander opened the door, and the three of them stepped into the light together. The engines began to hum, low and steady, as the jet prepared to leave. This time, Grace was not standing on the curb watching someone choose a life without her. She was walking toward the one she had built. Ethan remained behind the glass, surrounded by polished floors, quiet executives, and the wreckage of every excuse he had once mistaken for power. Grace did not look back again. She had not won him back. She had won the life he never believed she could build, and it was far too beautiful for his regret to enter.